Okay, we are here with Mr. Justin Young. This is an episode of Nonfiction Narrative Discourses, aka Beyond the Bio. So, the whole point of this project, Mr. Young, is to go beyond the bio that's written on your information on the communications webpage and maybe bridge some gaps, get to know you better, and also advertise for any upcoming projects or classes that you have coming up. And specifically, I wanted to reach out to you and discuss the upcoming spring class that you have regarding the history of gaming. This recording will go out on Twitch. So the Digital Humanities Lab is kind of working to familiarize people with new media. So I wanted to talk to you about new media and your take on gaming and the history of, and kind of get to know you better for that sort of thing. But to start off with, the specific other things that I want to know are where you're from, how you got to SIU, and why you teach what you teach.
Okay, well, first, thanks for having me, Holly. I'm glad to be here, virtually, I guess. Here,
right.
So where am I from? I am from Paducah, Kentucky, which is about 75 miles or so from Carbondale. Is the largest metropolitan area in the Western Kentucky area. How did I get to SIU? I meandered all over the country, or at least north and south all over the country. So I started my college career at Murray State University, which is in Murray, Kentucky. And then I taught there for a couple of years after finishing my graduate degree, and then took a job in Mississippi before then heading very far north, a brief stop in Indianapolis, but eventually on the very northeast tip of Indiana. So about 10 minutes from the Michigan border and 10 minutes from the Ohio border. And then coming back to SIU was an opportunity to be close to home and be close to family and friends and the area that I grew up in. So that's really how I kind of ended up back at SIU. It was like finally finding that ideal opening that was close. So it was the right fit for me, and apparently the right fit for them as well. And it has been. So over the last 3 years, I think it's been a good fit. And so I've been happy here. And why do I teach communication? I've always had an interest and a love of communication, whether that was through, reading of literature or writing or making, videos and films, building things online, websites and different things. So this was, teaching communication has really just let me continue doing the things that I always loved to do. And ideally, hopefully, kind of pass on some of that passion to my students as well, so that, that's always the hope, I think, of most teachers, that they'll have that, their students will leave with that same love of the material they teach that the teachers have, right?
Sure. So, but you had a long-standing webcomic, is that right?
Yes. I did a comic called Professor Hobo, which was something I had no idea I would turn into Professor Hobo at some point. But that was something we started in college. One of my best friends and I started kind of on a lark. We started, and we actually began it as for the college newspaper. So we were actually doing it for the college newspaper. And then from there, it kind of grew. It eventually became, after we were done as students, it became more webcomic focused. And but we also did animated episodes, and we did a few of those animated episodes for a a cable television network called College Sports Television,
Hmm.
which has now been rebranded as CBS College Sports.
Okay. So were you doing the illustrations and the writing? This was like you were working with someone else on this project?
Yeah, so no, I did the writing. This
Okay.
should be no surprise given my background. I was the writer. He's the artist. He's a graphic designer by trade. And so he's much better at art than I am. I sometimes get called out. Somebody will be like, well, I want to see you draw something. And I'm like, it's going to be stick figures. Like, that's the extent of my artistic ability. But he is a very good artist, and I did the writing, but it was very collaborative. I mean, it was one of the best experiences of my life as far as like being collaborative with somebody. The two of us were really good friends. We knew each other. We had very similar kind of senses of humor and kind of approaches to things. So even though I was technically the writer and he was technically the artist, it was often me, writing a description of a character. The character should look like this and they should have these features. And then it was him coming back and saying, I like this joke, but I don't think the wording is exactly right. What if we change these two words around? And so, we really worked together on it.
Was this a weekly project?
So when we were doing it for the college paper, it was weekly. And then when we started doing it online, we got to the point where we were doing it 3 times a week. So it was like a Monday,
Wow.
Friday. And then at one point while we were doing that, we actually got hired by another website that wanted to like sort of syndicate some of our strips. So they were running, I forget what it was, maybe 1 strip a week they were running onto their website. And then there were 2 others that were running on our website that were wholly original. So yeah, it kept us fairly busy.
I bet. That's great. That's great that you got that amount of coverage and there was that amount of readership and sounds like a pretty wide audience.
Um, I think it was at times. I think the thing that's probably the weirdest is when I run into somebody and somebody mentions the name of it and they're like, oh yeah, I've seen that before. And I always think that's the most bizarre experience.
So how long did that run for?
Um, we probably in total from when we started in college to when we finished, we probably did almost close to 10 years of it.
Oh, wow.
But that was not necessarily on for that full 10 years. So there
Okay.
were like breaks in there and some different things. But it was multiple years that we were doing it.
So then your graduate work was in electronic journalism, is that right?
My undergraduate is in electronic
Oh,
journalism.
okay.
My graduate work is in mass communication.
Oh, mass communication. Okay. So what was your main project for your graduate work? Or did you have a thesis?
We did not do a thesis. We did exams. We
Oh,
did
okay.
exams. So
Okay.
no thesis for that.
Gotcha. So then I would assume with this upcoming class that you're offering, the history of gaming, that you have presumably been a gamer for your entire life, or when did your gaming career start?
So I've been playing video games basically as far back as I can remember. So starting with an Atari, and then very quickly after that, proceeding to a Commodore 64, which was a computer in the early 80s. As I tell students, it's still the best-selling computer model ever. And so that's really, I think, more than the Atari, that's where my like sort of, I don't know, my gaming education took place. My where I really grew a love for it and everything was with the Commodore 64. So it still holds a very dear place in my heart.
And my understanding is there's programs now that can play old games, old Commodore games. Is that right?
Sure, yeah. There's emulation software on certainly on computers, but it can even run on cell phones,
Oh, wow.
that will allow you to emulate basically almost any game ever made at this point. There some of the like more recent newer consoles, so like the last generation of consoles, your PlayStation 4, your Xbox One, I don't know that they're emulated really very well right now, but like even systems up to the Nintendo Switch, which is Nintendo's current system,
Mhm.
you can emulate those fairly accurately at this point.
Okay. So what is I figure since we have a good amount of time here,
Mhm.
instead of doing an elevator pitch, I was thinking about a stairwell pitch for for this class that you have that you're offering, the history of gaming. Did you have to pitch this to the department, or and how did it come about that you were able to offer this class? And what are the key elements that you're wanting to help people understand by providing this class?
So we actually have a special topics course within our program that's built into our curriculum. And it came up, it was my turn to teach the special topics course. And so my chair asked me, Sandy Pinsino Conway, asked me if I was, did I have any idea what I wanted to teach? And I said, well, I'd really like to teach this course. I had actually taught this course, or at least a version of it, at a previous university.
Okay.
So it's not a wholly original this time out. And she approved it and said, sure, let's offer it. And as far as what the course is, so the course, the full title is Video Games, Art, History, and Culture of a Medium, which is one of those like gigantic titles for a course that is like impossible to fully cover, obviously.
Sure.
I tell students the first day, like, this is the ultimate survey course. Like, this would be like saying we're going to cover, like romanticism within a single course, right? Like,
Sure.
you can't cover Blake within a single course. So,
Right.
my sort of pitch of it is, okay, well, we're going to look at the history of video games, and we're going to start in the 1860s in the Lincoln White House, where Abraham Lincoln plays an early precursor to pinball.
Oh, neat.
And then we kind of just trace it from there, and like looking at the development of pinball and how pinball eventually leads to the development of arcades, and and some of the people who are involved in those arcades early on see the value of when video games start coming into the picture. And then we trace all that up into modern day, though. Kind of like a lot of history classes, I'm less concerned with the last 10 years than I am than what's come before, because one of the things that I find interesting, I think is valuable to look at with video games, is how one thing leads to another. So like how a video game from the 1970s leads to a video game of the 1980s, which leads to a game of the 90s, and so on. And so that you can see that development, right?
Mhm.
Like I think of, I think sometimes that's done with literature courses, but like we maybe sometimes don't think of literature as necessarily being like, well, this book led to this book, which led to this book. And
Right.
video games and film, I think in a lot of ways, we see that a much clearer path from one to the next to the next. And certainly with video games, I mean, you look at the original Super Mario Brothers versus, Mario Odyssey, the most recent Mario video game. And you can certainly see the DNA there that dates back, 40 years at this point to the original Super Mario Brothers. So that's part of the course, is like charting that and looking at that. Part of it is looking at how different social issues kind of influence the development of video games. So like, if you go back to the 1930s, there's a push to make pinball illegal
Huh.
in different parts of the US. So, for example, New York City, pinball was illegal for decades.
Interesting.
And there's a great photograph of Mayor LaGuardia of New York City, who the airport today is named after,
Sure.
with a sledgehammer smashing pinball machines,
Oh,
because
wow.
this was part of their crackdown on organized crime.
Okay.
And the belief was that pinball was not a game of skill, it was a game of chance. And therefore, because it was not a game of skill, it was more akin to gambling
Sure.
than something that required actual skill to be able to do. So that leads, so early pinball games don't have the flippers, so you hit the buttons on the side of a pinball machine, you have the flippers at the bottom that can control the ball and prevent it from going down into the hole. Early pinball machines don't have that.
Oh,
So early pinball machines are, this may be a reference that you get. Sometimes it's a little outdated of a reference for some of my students, but Plinko on The Price is Right.
sure.
So it's much more like we're going to shoot a ball up and just let it drop wherever it may go.
Right. You're
And
just
so,
having a throw and see what happens.
yeah, so there really isn't much of a skill involved with it at that point. And because of that, there was this fear that it could be used by, or it was being used by, organized crime, and it was some form of gambling. There was a fear that it was cheating children out of their money, because children were going and playing pinball machines, but there was no skill, so like you were really just taking these kids' money away from them, which is kind of funny when you get to modern video games and all the worries about how they're cheating children.
Oh my goodness, yes.
And so, like looking at the cultural issues, the fact that organized crime was an actual concern, and it still is obviously today, but not in the same way, right? Like,
Sure.
and so the fact that there's this great fear of that leads to changes in the development of pinball, and eventually leads to pinball becoming a much bigger, more successful game, because now it's skill based and people want to keep playing it. It's less of a novelty game and more of something that you can get better at, right?
Okay.
And so then we can look at more modern, eventually down the line, we kind of look at more modern comparisons to that. So like how the Street Fighter line of games, Street Fighter 1 and really Street Fighter 2, changed the way that we think of video games as being something that you do for fun to something that you can like master and require like a certain expertise, or that takes time to get to. So Street Fighter 2 is really credited with popularizing the fighting game genre. So from it, we get all of our Mortal Kombats and different games of that nature. But one of the things that Street Fighter 2 does is it, instead of press A to jump and press B to kick, something simplistic like that, it starts saying, okay, well, like A is your punch button, B is your kick button, but if you press down forward plus kick, you'll do a special punch, or you'll throw a fireball. And not only is that important that you have to memorize how all those special moves, but then you have to get good at doing those special moves. Like you have to practice, and then once you've practiced them, you have to learn the timing of when to do them. So knowing that when you throw a fireball, you leave yourself vulnerable for half a second where somebody can counter that. And then from that, you start thinking of the like mental side of the game. And if you're playing competitively, fighting another human being, like, okay, how do I psych them out and make them think I'm going to throw a fireball this time, and I'm not going to throw a fireball, so I can catch them when they jump in and try to do a move on me.
Okay. Was there multiplayers in arcade games?
Yeah.
Oh,
So
okay.
Quite a few arcade games are multiplayer, and so um, that's the sort of thing that we're looking at. We're looking at how video games influence movies,
Mhm.
how movies influence video games. And like one of the things I sometimes use when I'm describing the course is, so in the 1980s, there's this sort of Japanese scare in the US
Mm.
that Japan is buying up property in the US. So very famously, like they buy up Rockefeller Center in New York City. And there's this fear that Japan is going to buy up all of America. They're going to, it's sort of this lingering, I guess, sort of underlying racism that it's playing off of, is still from veterans of World War II and their children, the sort of baby boomer generation. That we've got to stop them. And so one of the things I tell students is, I still remember as a kid going to parades in the 1980s and the local union handing out bags for you to collect your candy at the parade, and the bag says, don't buy Japanese products, buy American. And
Wow.
so that in turn, that's something that, like, I don't think ever gets talked about in classes. I never hear anybody talk about it anymore. But in turn, that leads Nintendo, that when they're launching in the US, they're having to hire a spokesperson. So one of their qualifications for hiring a spokesperson for Nintendo is, we want somebody who looks the most American possible.
Wow.
So they hire a guy with bright red hair and freckles, because in their mind, that was the most American looking person they could find. And things like that. And so it's not just let's talk about asteroids and Dig Dug, though we do talk about those sorts of things, but it's also about, okay, well, why does Dig Dug get made, and what does Dig Dug lead to, and why is Dig Dug eventually obsolete and arcades sort of collapse in popularity, and what does that mean for our broader culture and everything?
That's great. Are you familiar? There's when you were talking about film, there's a documentary about, is it The King of Kong, maybe? It's
Yes.
about the guy who kind of got the best score for Donkey Kong.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great documentary. It's very interesting. Kind of somewhat comical, but definitely kind of talks about how some people see it as a skill, and it's something to kind of be worked at and worked at and worked at. And he spent a lot of time kind of perfecting what he was doing. So yeah, I can definitely see. I almost wonder too about how cinematography impacts games, in the sense of, as movies kind of improve on their look, games also improve on their look.
Mm-hmm.
The graphics continue to look better. The camera, the point of view continues to change and improve and do different things. So yeah, I can definitely see how there's a crossover there. And then I can also see how what you were just talking about with Nintendo, you have a PR background as well. Is that right?
Yes.
So then I can see how there's also got to be quite a bit of PR involved in gaming.
Mm-hmm.
I would just imagine, as far as marketing goes, and there's also kind of been quite a bit of pushback. I'm sure you remember this, and I'm sure it also kind of is similar to what you were just saying about the kind of, what about the children concern. Is there's been a lot of that with gaming, at least since I was a kid. Just how are these games impacting our children? If they're spending so much time playing these games, what impact is it having on their social skills? What impact is it having on their ability to do their homework and interact with their families? And I think each generation kind of has their own what about the children kind of concern, but it does seem like gaming has been has been at the cultural forefront of a lot of concerned mothers for a few decades now.
Sure, yeah. And that's one of the things that having a background in communication really helps with, because that's something I've certainly taught in a communication course before, just talking about the history of how every new medium that comes along, there's this sort of moral panic around.
Mhm.
So there's a moral panic around radio, and like we all remember the stories of War of the Worlds, and they do the production of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and that people are panicking in the streets and everything. Well, the reality is that story is way overblown.
Right.
It's not quite the way that it gets told and everything, but that same fear comes along with the advent of movies, right? That
Mhm.
there's the famous story that people went to the first movies and it's the train coming towards the screen, and people panicked and ran out of the theater because they thought a train was going to come out of the screen at them.
Right.
Again, sort of blown out of proportion. That's not quite reality. People, as I tell students often, just because people were living 100 years ago doesn't mean they were complete rubes. They
Right.
understood reality even then.
Right.
But then the moral panic of television, right? That this is bringing this right into the home, and the panic around rock and roll, and Elvis is gyrating his hips on television.
Right.
And we get it with comic books.
Comic books. Yeah.
The part of the reason there's a difference between Marvel and DC is that DC fell under the comics code, and there were all these rules about what DC could show in comics and everything. And so
Really?
rules about not showing characters using guns or drinking or being in some way a bad influence.
Huh.
There was the Hayes Code for television. That's where we get the rules about, if a man and woman are in bed, one of them has to have a foot on the floor at all times.
Right.
So, those sorts of rules and like panic from society about, oh, there's this new medium. How's it going to corrupt and ruin our children? Right. We see that with each new medium as it comes along. We see it with video games. And I think more recently, obviously, we see it with the internet, right?
Right.
In the mid 90s, when web access is first starting to get popular, we see lots of parents, just, well, I will never have the internet in my home, not with my children. And these are the same people now giving phones to 5-year-olds. Their
Right.
5-year-old has a smartphone that gives them access to anything in the world.
Right.
And I think that happens with every new sort of medium that comes along. And then there's an adjustment period, right? People, they way overreact, they panic, and then they sort of pull back and they go, wait, we way overreacted about that. And usually as the next generation, technically I fall under Generation X. So I feel like as Generation X grew up with video games and matured and started having children of their own, they were like, no, it's not the end of the world. Let the
Right.
kid play Mario Kart. He's not going to like murder anyone because of Mario.
Right. Right.
And so, in the same way that we don't think anything of television now, right? Like in fact, we embrace television as being healthy for kids in some ways, with shows like Sesame Street and Blue's Clues, like educational type programming. So I think we're seeing the same thing with video games as we move to new generations. I look at my students now, and my students now have never really known a time when video games weren't just a huge part of culture.
Huh.
They've never known a time when, most people they knew weren't playing video games really of some kind.
Mm.
As I point out to them, like, yeah, your mom's maybe not playing Xbox with you, but she's playing Candy Crush on her phone,
Sure.
or she's playing solitaire. My mom plays solitaire like on her iPad. And so, I think that they have grown up in a world where video games are just the norm.
Sure.
And so there's not the same sort of panic around them. Not to say there aren't still fears, but they're not the same type of fears that they were, even 20 years ago, but certainly 30, 40 years ago.
Sure. So when you were initially doing the research for this class, was there any aspects of gaming that surprised you that you weren't aware of? Things that you just thought were kind of extraordinary or out of the ordinary?
Oh, I mean, I think it's like any field, right? Like you're constantly learning new things. So, I try to be honest with my students. Like I learned something new about video games on a weekly basis. And there's entire organizations. There's an organization called the Video Game History Foundation.
Oh,
And
neat.
their entire goal is to chronicle the history of video games. And do that in part by doing interviews with people who were developing those games, but they even go out and do interviews with like the person who was the head of PR when this game system launched, so that they can figure out like, okay, well, how did you launch this game system and what were the issues and problems that you were running into at the time. So yeah, there's like tons of stuff I'm still learning all the time and learning from them. So like, like one of the recent episodes of that podcast, I'll just give them a plug because this is where I learned this. I did not know there's a game. There's a game for the Atari called Custer's Last Stand, and it is well known for being a pornographic video game. Now, is pornographic on an Atari, so the listeners can use their imagination about what that actually looks like. But more to the point, why it was considered so, one, I think it's remembered so much because there's been pornographic games for the entire history of video games, is that you're just crossing the screen while dodging arrows that are firing down from above you. And when you get to the other side, there's a woman tied up to a cactus or a post. And basically your character, for all intents and purposes, like rapes this woman when it reaches her. And so it's been very like talked about over the history of video games. Like, why does something like this get made? Well, apparently the company that made this was a company that made pornography, made video pornography. And they thought getting into video games would be a really great way to make money. And so one of the things about that sort of podcast is they talk about, well, just their complete misunderstanding of what video games were capable of showing, like how difficult they were to make, how much time they took. You're talking at that time months of development time versus a pornography film that you could make in an afternoon, right? And that they just don't have any conception for this. But one of the things that was really fascinating that came out of that was that the company, that one of the directors who had worked for them and made their pornographic films was Ed Wood. The famous, Z movie director. That is the focus of a very famous film starring Johnny Depp. So, things like that, like little connections and everything that you start to discover. I'm always learning stuff like that. And I think stuff like that's fascinating. And it kind of ties, you start to see how video games aren't as segregated in their development as they're often portrayed.
Sure.
Right. Like it wasn't just a bunch of guys off in some broom closet making video games, but like they were part of everything else that was going on in media at the time. But sometimes those stories aren't very well told.
Sure. So what other new media do you teach on? I know it says that you've got interests that include new media. So what other types of new media do you talk about in classes that you offer?
So right now I'm teaching a course called Social Media and Digital Communication. So that course obviously focuses on social media, but it's also looking at digital communication more broadly. So we look at things like how to manage content management systems like WordPress or Joomla or Drupal. We talk about, how the internet has fundamentally changed our culture. We in that course we read John Ronson's book on So You've Been Publicly Shamed.
I've read it. It's very good.
Yeah, it's a book I like, but it provokes a lot of interesting discussion among students. And so we talk about that book, and we talk about the concept, of a big part of that book is his idea of, okay, like shaming is okay at a point, but at a point, like, where do we draw the line, right?
Yeah, unintended consequences for sure, I think is kind of the lesson of that book.
Right. And so, now we use the term cancel culture, and, that's something that a lot of students have very strong opinions about. And, and certainly there are situations, right? Like where I think most people agree, oh, well, that person doesn't need to be in any sort of position of power anymore.
Right.
But there are also situations where, this person made one off-color joke.
Right.
Do they deserve to be banished from working in comedy the rest of their career?
Forever. Right.
Yeah. And, like, at what point do we say, okay, you've been punished, you've been shamed, or you've lost something, you lost this TV show or whatever you've been working on, but we have to let you like kind of come back and like continue to pursue this. And we talk about the various levels of, okay, somebody makes an off-color joke, that's forgivable, but like, what are the sins or crimes that somebody's committing that are unforgivable, that like we don't want to ever see that person again? And I think that becomes very difficult for students. Certainly just this semester, while we've been talking about this book, we've had the Dave Chappelle incident at Netflix with his special where he made comments that a lot of people viewed as demeaning of transgender people. And, like, I've been a Dave Chappelle fan. I liked his show on Comedy Central. I don't like every joke that Dave Chappelle does, and I haven't liked everything he's done, but I've certainly laughed at Dave Chappelle over the years. Where do I draw that line? I don't want to support somebody who's a transphobe, who is out there putting out, obviously anti-trans person rhetoric on a regular basis. Something, obviously, you being over in creative writing English, I'm sure gets talked about with J.K. Rowling quite a bit, with some of her comments. And where do we draw that line, right? Like, do we burn down the wizarding world of Harry Potter at Universal Studios, or do we boycott them, or do we throw out our Harry Potter books? And that's a question maybe bigger than just digital media, but that's kind of the front lines of where that fight is going on often, on social media.
Sure. Yeah. And then it gets into kind of free speech concerns, which I would imagine, I mean, I don't know for sure just because I'm not a gamer, but I would imagine that free speech concerns can be part of gaming as well. I mean, are there are there games? I mean, you actually did speak about this other game that wound up being pornographic, but there's got to be games that are for the general public that somebody deems problematic at some point.
Yeah, sure. So in the class, we talk about a very famous game called Night Trap that came out in the 90s. And was one of the early games to be released onto the CD-ROM format.
Okay.
So as video games are transitioning from cartridge to CD-ROM, we get Night Trap and some other games similar to it. And it uses full motion video. So they actually went out and filmed scenes of actors on sets and everything, and you're interacting with that footage. Night Trap's not a very good game. It never was a very good game. Even at the time of release, it wasn't a very good game. But what Night Trap is most remembered for, and it would probably be largely forgotten if not for this, is that Congress actually held hearings on Night Trap at the time.
Huh.
And about whether these games should be outright banned. And it's very similar to the hearings that were held in the 80s over music.
Okay, yeah.
That was largely targeted towards rap music.
Right.
But, was also some heavy metal and that kind of music as well. But eventually that leads to the warning labels. Of course, like nobody buys CDs anymore, so I guess it doesn't really matter. But we end up with warning labels on CDs that say this contains explicit lyrics or something of that nature.
Right.
So those hearings in the 90s on video games look at Night Trap, they look at Mortal Kombat, again, which kind of comes off of the success of the Street Fighter games we were talking about earlier. And Mortal Kombat was very notable because they basically filmed real actors and then used the images of real actors in the game and then allowed you to kill the other player. So you could, knock this guy's head literally off and across the stage. And it had blood and everything. And so we talk about that. And of course, Nintendo always kind of sucking up to the general public. Nintendo very famously at those hearings before Congress gets up and says, well, you'll never see these games on a Nintendo system. You'll never see Night Trap on a Nintendo system, which is funny because a few years ago they re-released Night Trap and they did put it onto a Nintendo system.
Oh, funny.
But yeah, and that eventually leads to the rating system that we see today on video games, the electronic, the ESRB, Electronic Systems Rating Board, I think is what ESRB stands for. I can't remember the S right now. Electronic Ratings Board with an S in there that means something. I forget.
So you personally, if you feel like sharing, are there any games that you are particularly partial to, ones that you've always played and always loved?
Oh yeah, I mean, we have a limited amount of time, so but yeah, I mean, there are, I think oftentimes people, when they find out I teach a class on video games, they'll go, okay, well, what's your favorite video game
right
ever? And I used to teach film, and so I got used to like just going Casablanca. They'd go, really, Casablanca? And I was like, I don't know, like it's an easy answer, and I do love that movie, and like it would be more accurate to say I can give you a top 50, and
right
like at any point one of them could move up higher depending on my mood that day.
right
So video games are kind of the same way, but oftentimes when I get asked that question, I'm like, Super Mario World is maybe to me like the best video game ever made. And I don't know that it's the best video game ever made, but it's the easiest answer for me to give. And, because like if I was going to be 100% honest, I think the best video game ever made is Tetris.
Okay.
I think Tetris is the perfect video game. is remarkably just simplistic
Mhm.
in its design, and anybody can pick up and learn to play it in a few minutes. But it's one of those games you can play the rest of your life and never quite master.
Right.
And I just think it's brilliant. I mean, just from a basic game design, that's a brilliantly designed game.
So much so that it gets stuck in your brain and you can dream in Tetris.
Right. And in fact, that's something we talk about in the class. There's actually something called the Tetris Effect.
Hmm.
And that's exactly what you're talking about, like people dreaming and seeing the pieces in their dreams, or the fact that, you know, you'll be walking through a building and looking at the tile on the floor or the ceiling and, you know, seeing the pieces and thinking about how they're linking together and everything. Yeah, Tetris is fascinating. I mean, even the backstory behind Tetris is fascinating. And,
What's a
you know,
thumbnail sketch on that?
so Tetris is designed by a Russian developer who basically just never got any of the proceeds originally from the game. Like the game
Hmm.
was taken away from him, and for a while he wasn't even receiving the credit publicly, at least for it. And over the years he's certainly received the you know, since the fall of the Soviet Union and everything, he certainly has received that public accolade. But you know, you would think Tetris is probably the best-selling video game of all time.
Huh.
You know, that always gets a little kind of funky when you try to figure that out. Like, but it is probably the game that, you know, has been played the most worldwide over the years. And you know, you think about that, and that guy should be a multi-billionaire, if anything is fair. When you think about the guy who made Minecraft is a billionaire and the guy who made Tetris is not, you know, there's
Ah.
something weird and out of place going on. But having said all that, like it's just a fascinating game, and if you're looking at a game as far as pure game design, it gets to the core of pure game design, right? Of something that you can understand very quickly and keep coming back to, and there's a reason to keep coming back to it. But yeah, Super Mario World is probably the one that I usually give, because I think it's the game I'd probably, at this point, I've played so much Tetris. Mario World's the game I'd rather go back and play at this point.
Gotcha.
But you know, it's like film. I could give you like a list of 50 games and tell you why each one. My students in class recently, not in my video game class, in a different class, they did ask me, they were like, what's a game that you really loved as a kid? And I said, Popeye. And they said, there's a Popeye video game? And I said,
Yeah.
yeah. It was made by Nintendo. And it was released into arcades. It eventually got a home port. But I loved that game as a kid. And I don't know 100% why. There were certainly games that were equal. It's a good game, but there were games that were equally as good. It's just a very kind of simple game to play, and it has a lot of kind of the Donkey Kong spirit. So Donkey Kong was originally supposed to be a Popeye game.
Oh, okay.
And when you know that, it makes a whole lot of sense,
Sure.
because Pauline, the woman that you're trying to rescue, looks an awful lot like Olive Oil. Donkey Kong looks an awful lot like Bluto. And, you know, it kind of, the fact that you get power-ups, right? You can imagine Mario's hammer being a can of spinach instead.
Right.
But Nintendo at the time could not get the license to Popeye, and so they had to make up their own original game instead.
Okay.
Eventually, they did get that license, and they made a Popeye video game, and I love that game. it was one of those games that when I would go to an arcade, I always had to play Popeye. And yeah, and that's an interesting cultural thing too, because Popeye hasn't been popular in the US in decades, but
Right.
Popeye's really popular in Japan. And my
Huh.
understanding is it's still very popular in Japan. And that's kind of weird to us because Popeye is, sort of like Betty Boop or something. It's
Right, a
like,
throwback, yeah.
yeah, we don't think of it as still being all that relevant in popular culture. So yeah, that's a game. There's a game called Congo Bongo, which was Sega's attempt to basically copy Donkey Kong, but do Donkey Kong better.
Okay.
And I used to really love that game when I was a kid. The Showbiz Pizza,
Oh,
which
sure.
for younger listeners, Showbiz Pizza was what Chuck E. Cheese, it eventually became Chuck E. Cheese.
Right.
Showbiz buys Chuck E. Cheese and then rebrands because Chuck E. Cheese, I guess, was a better branding. But Congo Bongo used to be at our local Showbiz, and we didn't go to Showbiz very often because I feel like kids go to Chuck E. Cheese a whole lot more today than we ever went to Showbiz. I think Showbiz was really expensive when we were kids.
Mm.
But anyways, we would go occasionally there, and I would always play Congo Bongo, and I just thought it was like the coolest looking game, and it was a lot of fun. And that's the sort of game I can still play today and be like, yeah, this still holds up. This is a fun game.
Nice. So I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I do need to ask, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at any of the other Neophyte Studios Twitch streams, but they started as two graduate research assistants playing games together and discussing the narrative aspects of the game. So because they were creative writing graduate research assistants, so they're going to be talking about the writing. So my question to you is, I may start doing that, playing games and streaming playing games on Twitch. However, I am not a gamer, so I will be learning on the fly. But are there any narrative focused, like story focused games that you might suggest would be good to try for someone who's new to gaming?
The Life is Strange games, of which there have been 3 mainline games, I guess, and there's like one spinoff, I think. And they just came out with a 3rd one called True Colors. Those are fantastic narrative-driven games, and they're also, I think, games that don't require like lightning fast reflexes and everything, which is usually easier for somebody who's playing games for the first time. Those games are really good. A lot of the there was a Walking Dead series of games, which I know may not appeal to everyone, but like these were story-driven games, and they were really innovative at the time, because one of the things that they did was they were released episodically. And actually Life is Strange was released episodically. So like they would release a chunk of the game and then 2 months later release another chunk of the game, and release them, even titling them as episodes, so that it was very much pitching them as like a TV show, and this is all going to lead up to the season finale of this.
Interesting.
So they did that with the Walking Dead, and those games, like, you can play on a cell phone, better on a tablet, like an iPad or something, but they also are on PC and game consoles and everything. And those games were really neat because they had so many branching paths. Like, do you get in the car or do you run? And if you try to run, then the zombies get one of your friends, and then that friend is dead, and they're not going to show up later in the game
Right.
because they're now dead and out of the game, and that changes the story because of it. But even as the additional episodes come out, that character is written out of the story at that point.
Okay.
And that's kind of delivering on the promise of interactive fiction,
Yeah.
right? Or a much more heightened version of the choose your own adventure type books,
Right.
to some degree. So I think those games are really interesting, and they're very accessible to somebody who doesn't play a lot of video games. Um, let's see, the Last of Us.
Okay.
There's two of those, The Last of Us and Last of Us Part 2. They're a little bit more actiony, but just a fantastic story. HBO is actually adapting those games into a series next year. And so, but they have a good story, an interesting story, particularly for a video game. The second one, the main protagonist is a woman. It's actually two women, because I don't want to get too spoilery, but it jumps back and forth between their two different perspectives. And Life is Strange is the same way. And actually, I guess some of the Walking Dead games the same way. And that's always interesting, because traditionally video games have been very male oriented, because the people who were making them were often men. And so they were writing them, like I'm sure you're aware of from a creative writing class and everything, people write themselves into their stories, right?
Sure.
And so people were writing themselves into their games. And so those are really interesting. From a more historical background, I always think a lot of the Sierra or LucasArts adventure games that were made in the 80s and into the mid 90s, those games are really interesting to go back and play. Things like the King's Quest games, Phantasmagoria, The Secret of Monkey Island. Those games are really interesting to go back and play. And they were made as 2D games, so they've aged, but they don't look too bad. And at least with the LucasArts games, they've gone back and remastered some of those games and updated the art in them. So they very much hold up today. And The Secret of Monkey Island is maybe the funniest video game ever made, which is, if you're looking at narrative structure and telling a story, one of the biggest difficulties in video games is making a video game that's funny.
Yeah.
Because you may die 5 times getting through this part of the level, and now you're hearing that same joke 5 times, and now it completely lost all of its humor.
Then it's stale, yeah.
Right. And that's something with a movie, you can watch it through and then come back 3 years from now and watch it again, and you may have forgotten all but the biggest punchlines. But with a video game, you're replaying that 5 minutes later, and it's gone completely stale. So it's interesting whenever a video game gets that right. I don't think there are that many funny video games, but The Secret of Monkey Island is genuinely a funny video game.
Good to know. Okay, well, I will definitely be looking at some of your suggestions, and we'll see what we can come up with. So do you have anything as far as projects that are coming up? Or, I mean, of course, we want people to sign up for the upcoming spring class. I don't know, is it full?
It is not full currently.
Okay, so yeah, definitely, folks out there, if you're interested in learning about the history of video games, reach out to Mr. Justin Young. But did you have any upcoming projects or anything else that you wanted to pitch or let people know about?
I don't know if there's anything too far off, I can pitch. I actually do a podcast for our department. So we do a podcast called the Communication Studies Podcast. And right now it's really kind of doing a lot of what you're doing with this show. It's interviewing our faculty and some of our graduate students, particularly looking at their research and kind of going into their background on, why are you doing something with communication as a field? And then long term, we hope to kind of branch out a little bit more into people in different communication related fields,
Great.
and talk to them and everything. So
are you putting that out weekly?
Semi-weekly. And so we've done 8 episodes so far, and occasionally there'll be a week off or something. So I actually did record an episode in advance for Thanksgiving week. So we actually did get an episode out during then, but like over Christmas break, I won't record any episodes.
Sure.
But yeah, it's just kind of a fun thing to kind of reach out and let people. One of the tenets of that podcast is really, it can sometimes be hard to get into a field and listen to people who are, experts in a field talk about something if you don't have any entryway into that.
Right.
So, they're using terminology that like you have no idea what that terminology means. I mean, earlier I mentioned Blake. I sort of know who I'm talking about, but somebody listening to this who's coming only to hear about video games may not know who William Blake is. Maybe they've never read William Blake in high school or college. So that's one of the things that we try to do in that podcast is go, okay, we're talking about performance studies. Let's define what performance studies is for the lay person so that they have a way into this where they can kind of understand what this is. And so that's been really kind of fun and interesting to do because I'm learning just as much as the audience a lot of times because I have my specialty and I know my specialty pretty well, I think. But I'm not sure, I always know especially the details of my colleagues of what they're doing. And so that's been really fun. And the ability to talk to our graduate students who are, obviously writing their dissertations, and they have all this kind of interesting research that they're doing that is hopefully, theoretically, something entirely new. And that makes it really fun to get to talk to them about that. Because that's something that often they haven't had a chance to talk to, people outside of their advisor about a whole lot.
That's great. So the link, I think I did come across that. The link to that podcast is on the SIU Communications website.
I believe it is on the website, but you can also find it on basically any podcast distributor like Apple or Spotify or Google. Just search for Communication Studies. And I think it's the first podcast that pops up now when you search for that.
Oh, great. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
That means it's getting some hits, right?
Yeah. I mean, it is getting some people to listen to it. And occasionally we get like, I can see some of the backside details, and occasionally we'll see like somebody in Germany listen to this. And I'm like, is that an alumni or like who in Germany is listening to this?
Yeah, that's great. That's good. So if anyone's interested, definitely check out the communications podcast. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank you for being here tonight, for being willing to be a part of this project, and for your time. I very much appreciate it. Are you okay if people have questions, if they can just reach out to your SIU email?
Sure. My SIU email is justin.young at siu.edu. So that's JUSTINYOUNG at siu.edu. Okay,
great. Well, so this is being pre-recorded tonight. I will definitely let you know when it streams. So
Great.
I'll keep you clued in on that, and definitely let me know if there's anything the English department or the Digital Humanities Lab can do for you guys, and we'll try and get together on that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely with some of the stuff it sounds like you all are doing, I think there are things that maybe our course in the spring might want to reach out to you on some of that. So that would be great. So thanks, Holly.
Definitely. Well, thank you very much. And you have a lovely rest of your evening.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.